Hey everyone, welcome to the latest episode of our alphabetical taboo busting journey. This time we're going to talk about S for self-talk. And now self-talk is something that is becoming a bigger and bigger topic as people dive into the importance of how we talk to ourselves and about ourselves. But to make sure that I'm not just talking to myself, I'll introduce Sylvia and ensure that she's a part of this dialogue about our inner monologue.
Hello, John Thor. Always good to dialogue with you, my friend.
Likewise. Now it's I've realized that one of the things that I find really entertaining about recording these is that I never really think of what to say after the very first bit until we start recording. And the self-talk in my head is like, okay, think of something kind of smart or witty, and it it does drive me into that moment where the positive self-talk starts to come out that wouldn't have before, where actually if I say something I'm quite happy about it, I'm like, you go, you go,
Yeah,
girl, that was good, that was good.
yeah.
um, and and it's funny because like some years ago I would have found the idea of that positive self-talk to be something either pretentious or a little bit cringy, and I would have really lowered my own, I guess, perceived value of that self-talk, because I, not that I necessarily assumed that everyone spoke poorly of themselves, but rather that it felt like I had to force myself to say positive things about myself. And
Mhm.
I tied that very much in with struggling to take compliments from others as well. And to me, I always expected it to have to go the opposite route, where I was like, oh, as soon as I become more comfortable with like outside positive affirmations, I'll be more comfortable talking positively about myself. But in reality, to quote one of the biggest cliches there is, change comes from within. I needed to change the way that I spoke about myself and to myself. And I've seen such a massive change in my own outlook, my mental health, and also my performance at so many levels. And I know that you've got some interesting thoughts about, I guess, the effects of self-talk on performance. We touched upon that a little bit before.
Yeah, totally. Yet before we get there, I just want to really recognize and celebrate what you said a moment ago about really seeing the connection, right, between the image we have of ourselves and what that subsequent self-talk looks like, and how that ties into with the external validation that we either might be actively seeking or actively avoiding, depending on that right self-talk. And so I also want to share. Based on what you said a moment ago about how I also had cringed at the thought of like self affirmations, right? These positive self statements. And I have a story about that. Yeah, I do want to just share with the audience that I would love to, in the time we have, talk about what self talk is not, but also more importantly, to your point about how self talk and our work on that, given the and I'm going to say right way. I think there is a right way to do it, or a better way to do it anyway, that can help us in how we show up. So lots to unpack there. Yet I'll just address the first layer of what self talk is not, or what might have been cringeworthy for me as well. For me, it was actually watching someone else make hollow statements. So there was somebody around me who would constantly say these self-affirming statements, yet with nothing to back it up. So it would be these grandiose statements, or just even something like, I'm a winner, right? And yet then they would go do something else, or they would go do something that would be not in service of that mindset, or it was really set to elicit that external validation, right? So it's almost like they were looking for someone to go, hell yeah, you are a winner, versus going like, I'm a winner, I believe it, and I'm gonna show up accordingly. So I think I was taught a very limited, maybe even erroneous perspective of what it is. So it took me a really long time, to be honest, to even embrace this idea of self-talk. I remember somebody saying like, you gotta like practice saying loving things to yourself. I'm like, you're fucking out of your mind. right? What? Like, what are you on? So, yet this is the performance linkage that I want to share. I started to notice during tennis matches. So I'm a big fan of the sport, as many of you who've been following the series know by now. And I noticed during points, the top players would always do something which on camera looked like they were just like fidgeting with their racket or kind of like, jumping about. Yet like I could almost at certain points see their lips move, right? Even though it wouldn't be audible per se to those of us in the stands or at home watching. But what I caught on, like I literally watched like tournament after tournament, right? Match after match, like literally point after point. I'm like, I think they're talking to themselves. And I started to notice that they would, so let's say someone was down, right, a set or two, I'm sorry, a game or two, and right after a really critical point, let's say a particular player didn't do as well. Instead of having a fit, they might say something to themselves, or I could like see them literally like meditating on the bench, right, or just kind of closing their eyes, or kind of like just really focusing on the moment. And I started to wonder, like, I'm like, I think they're literally cheering themselves on because there's nobody else. Like, you can't get coached. No one else is talking to you. No one else is on your side, literally, right? So, yet, this is where I love to get your input. I can't prove that, right? Yet, I would see them come back almost like re-energize, refocus, or I could see like there's a new level of intensity in the way they would, await the incoming serve, or the way they would physically show up, right, to serve, or whatever their next action is. I guess my question back to you is, like, I'm no way to prove it. Right, from that scenario, yeah, like I kind of intuit that I think that's what's happening, and I've tried it on myself and I know it works. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on, in what manner and from what other scenarios have you been able to prove that linkage?
So I think one thing before I dive into that, actually, that I only started thinking about relatively recently is there was an ongoing discussion online a couple months ago about the difference between people that have an internal monologue and those that don't. And
Dang.
so the people that don't have an internal monologue might have a different type of self-talk. And when I think about what I now consider part of my self-talk, it's not just the words that I say to myself out loud or internally, but it's also the way that I think about myself, the way that I position myself in my mind. So, for example,
Mm.
because I kind of want to dive into a little bit of a music example, before I go on stage to play, I like to envision myself on stage playing well or performing well, and it kind of gets into this vibe. And I think I partially got that mindset and methodology from something that I think kind of proves the existence of this one man pep talk that you're saying you're seeing in tennis,
Mhm.
which is I saw this masterclass from a jazz pianist who was asked about what his number one improvisational tip was. And he said it was confidence. And I remember being like, man, what a load of shit. Similar to what you said, yeah,
Yeah.
where I was like, come on, like, obviously you need to, know your scales, know your
Right.
theory, whatever. I was like, man, that's not. And he, funny enough, like, I just thought this. I didn't say it out loud, obviously. But the guy's like, I know, like, to some of you, this sounds ridiculous, but let me show you something. And he played the same little jazzy line on the piano once, kind of hesitantly, like not with a lot of confidence, and you could
Mm.
hear the lack of confidence. And he was like, "This is how you hear a lot of people play. You, even though you're not listening to their voice, even though you close your eyes, you can hear the lack of confidence because they're already doubting themselves. They're saying, 'Oh, what if this isn't good enough? What if it isn't in key? What if I
Mm.
play the wrong note?'" And he
Mm.
said, "But actually, if you just dive in and just play with love and confidence." And then he just played something, and he said there was a bunch of notes there that probably didn't belong, but you know what? I played it like I meant it. And that, to me, I was like, hell yeah, that is exactly it. And I think I've told you the story before when I was one of the first times that I played in like a jam improvisational session, I was playing with this jazz trumpet player, and he said the number one rule is if you play the wrong note, you play it until it feels right. Um, and that's the level of confidence that we kind of need to have in our self-talk, where it's like, if
Mm,
I get it wrong, I'll just keep going. I'll try new things. I'll continue. I'll make things right. I'll make it work.
mm,
And I think for me, the barrier of entry into the whole idea of positive self-talk was that it felt delusional to me. Like I'd see, like I don't want to throw a lot of shade at this dude, but there's this guy who did a lot of talks with Tony Robbins. I don't know if he still does them. I think he's called something McClintock or anyway, doesn't really matter his name. Like that he has a load of cool ideas, but I remember there was this one bit of a talk by him that I saw where he talked about positive affirmations. And he said like you need to make yourself an incantation that you can like run on the beach and yell to yourself. And his example was like I am, and then like his whole name, and I am a winner, I am this, and I will do this, and I will beat the whole world because I'm a king. And I was like, nah, that like I don't care how much self work I do, that they'll just never feel like me.
right.
Um, and I think the problem for me was that there was no, I guess, role model or no representation of a different kind of self talk. It was just either you're being negative or you're shouting your own name while running on the beach.
I hope this is helpful. Yeah, I did. Now that you mentioned that story, I did found an interim or in between the two ends of that spectrum. So I was working with a phenomenal leadership group called High Five Leadership, and so Barb and Kevin and others on the team had helped me find well, not so much comfort level, but find that sweet spot, I would say, of like where I can learn to definitively and in a very affirming way say something positive about myself while not seeming like I'm just, chanting shit that had no meaning to me, or in a style that just would have no bearing on me whatsoever, like, or like you said, kind of be like grossed out by it even. So they actually had me practice saying a trait, right, that I would aspire to be more of. So for me, it's about patience, right? Like patience is a virtue I definitely lack as an ultra type A and a D on disc and all the related personality assessment outcomes relating to sort of that quadrant, if you will. So, they would literally have me practice, I am patient, right? Like not so much a chant, but as a self reminder, right? So it's almost taking something that I'm not yet good at and having a very simple statement, but that presumptive, right? We talk about presumptive closes a lot in our in our work. Yeah, this is almost like I'm presumptively closing myself on the idea that I am patient. And I was amazed when I said the first time I heard it out loud, like when I said it to myself, I am patient. I'm like, nah. But then when I said it, like, they're like, say it again, right? It's like, like really own it. Like I am patient. It's weird because after about probably 6 to 7 times, the idea kind of stuck and it led to the visualization that you talked about. All of a sudden I picture, I'm like not what if I were, but it's like I am, right? I am patient, and this is what a patient version of Sylvia Lee looks like. And that was, I think, the beginning of me learning that there is this other, right, realm that I hadn't really fully understood or tapped into and probably dismissed prematurely, right? Because of these other tactics and techniques that just frankly sounded like, crap without any basis to me. And so I offer that in really the hopes of starting a conversation with those watching to go, there is something about that declaration and that leads to that visualization that helps us then show up with the actions according to that declaration, especially if it is aspirational.
Yeah, and I think for me, it kind of falls into a similar area as gratitude and the idea of
Mm.
practicing gratitude. Um, because that to me was also one of those things where I was like, oh, that's tough.
Me
But
too.
I've found a similar middle ground, I guess, as what you just described, and it really spoke to me because the way that I found a good route towards positive external self-talk is practicing it with, as an example, my wife, because she knows my struggles with this. She knows that if I say something positive about myself, it's because I'm trying. I'm trying to get there. And I've found that even though it felt weird to begin with, now I've gotten into the habit of like if I'm really happy about something I did, I'll verbalize it. I'll be like, you know what? I'm really proud of the way that I wrote that, or like I'm really glad that I did that, or even similar to what you said about the patience. Like
Mhm.
I've said a few times throughout these episodes that like I've often dealt with like perfectionism with my music and everything, and just saying out loud to her like, you know, I'm not too late to get my
Mm.
music out there. There's still time. I'm going to do it. It was never the right time before because I didn't make it the right time. Now I'm gonna make it the right. Like these sorts of affirmations work for me.
Mhm.
And but it's partially because they're slightly different than shouting my name on the beach, but also because of that practice. And I found the same thing with the whole gratitude thing. Like
Mhm.
and I'm not talking about the whole sort of Pollyanna,
Right. Right.
waking up and being like, oh man, I'm glad I have limbs today. Um, but rather stating what you're grateful for, even if it's just from a point of view of telling the people that you really care about that you're grateful to have them, or like just to throw a bit of positivity Tony Robbins' way, because I'll admit I tend to take a lot of the classic inspirational speakers as poor examples of things at
Mhm,
times.
mhm.
But there was one line out of a Tony Robbins speech that just blew my mind like years ago, which was he was explaining that after I think it was his first world tour, that he came back to his house and realized that he'd made this commitment to write everyone thank you letters that had attended his shows. And he was like, crap, that's a lot of thank you letters to write. And he said he was basically sulking because of this. And he was like, I know how this sounds, but he
Yeah.
found it to be overwhelming. And he said the shift in his mindset that changed everything was like, when was there a time when I would have killed for this to be my problem? And he said he took a step back and he went, where was I like 6 years ago?
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
and he was like, suddenly when he kind of repositioned himself to think my problem is that there were so many people who paid good money to see me share my ideas that I now have to write a bunch of letters to these people that will mean a lot to them.
Mhm.
He was like, wow, the fact that this is my problem, whereas X amount of years, I can't remember if it's 4 or 6 or whatever, like my problems were these. If me back then could look at me now and see that as my problem, what would I think? And at the time when I heard this, it wasn't so much that I was in a position where I wasn't excited about what was going on or wasn't grateful, but it was more just that it, again, yeah, put things into a new perspective. Suddenly, I remember hearing this. I was listening to like an audiobook basically, and I remember immediately calling my wife and being like, man, I just had my mind blown because I did that same thing. I think he said 4 years because I remember thinking back and being like, okay, 4 years before then, I'd been like living with my parents. I'd been, just out of college, not really knowing where I wanted to go, just knowing that I didn't want to get sort of stuck in a situation. And then suddenly I was there, like on the streets of Barcelona, listening to a Tony Robbins audiobook while eating a freshly baked churro and like working internationally. And I'm like, man,
Mhm.
Yeah, you know what? Like there's stressful stuff at my job at that point, but
Mhm.
it's a pretty good problem to have.
What a beautiful story, and I can really relate because, um, and we've talked about this as friends. My first 3, 4 months of being on my own, right, as my own business owner, like, I had so much of that negative self-talk or not actually, I'm gonna rephrase that. I didn't know it was negative at the time. It was just talk. So again, like limiting belief, it was just facts, right? Almost the facts of life. It was like, wow, it's really hard to be on your own, and you literally have to like hunt even twice as much as you would as in large enterprise sales and all this other stuff, right? So first couple months I was really in a bad place because I didn't have that ability to shift perspective, right? The fact that like I could hang up my own shingle, like I would have killed for that 10, 15 years ago. Yeah, here I was doing exactly what I had dreamed of doing and like yearn for, that all I did was bitch about everything that was not working according to my vision, right? And then, I'm sure you and I have talked probably at like a couple of my lowest points where I'm like, why am I doing any of this? Yet there were times when you would remind me, like, Sylvia, what would you say to a friend in the exact same boat? And I know you practice that technique as well, right? If a friend came to you and said exactly what you're saying, what would you tell them? And that was the beginning of that shift in mindset. Because then I would literally be like, hey, look at all that is going well for you, right? Look at how much further you are ahead than somebody who's only 6 months in, right? Think of all the skills you had built and honed and practiced over a decade and a half in corporate on someone else's dime that you can now use over here, right? Like, and that was the beginning of learning that there is choice in my perspective. And then on top of that, this is what I coach people on, to build my own language of being my own biggest champion. Not to chant my name, not any of that, but it's like I actually didn't even have the language, right? To say some of the things you just said to yourself, right? Like gosh, this would have been a great problem to have back in the day, right? Or whatever, like those more positive energizing words and phrases. Like I literally had to build a library of what I now call champions language because I didn't have it. So it started with that shift in perspective that you encouraged me to have, and then me practicing a new language, which then led to new actions because now it's like, whoa, like there is something about saying the words out loud and having the belief catch up to the verbalization of that, and then the actions follow as a result of the words, the belief, right, the attitude and such. So it is the shit works, people. It's the tagline that I got for you.
Yeah, and I think, because you mentioned sort of the sales aspect, and it's funny because one of the things that is really commonly taught in sales coaching is that you don't tell someone they've got a problem, you ask and get them to say it, because if you tell them they've got a problem, they get defensive.
Mhm.
And it's interesting how self-talk basically works the same. If I tell myself I've got a problem, I'm probably going to believe it even if it isn't true. If someone else tells me, I'm going to get defensive. And sometimes we just got to get defensive with ourselves, because the problem with that self-talk is because it is so rooted in our
Mm,
patterns that
mm,
for me, I often verbalize it in a way where I say, if I don't let it out, it echoes in my head and it becomes like Chinese whispers, where it just becomes this warped version of whatever it started as.
mm.
And it becomes like it's almost like a dialogue, except it's like it's one-upping each other in how bad it can become. And it's so easy to fall into that. And it actually ties really nicely with next week's episode, because a lot of those patterns can be actually built on a foundation of trauma. So when we go through something traumatic, very often we don't realize that it is. And especially when it has something to do with our childhood or early memories, or
Mhm.
something that's just not typically envisioned as trauma.
Yeah.
And I'm actually really interested to see where we take that topic next week, because right now the world is going through a mutual sort of traumatic experience. And we talked about it a little bit in G for grief. But I think now it's even more poignant because when we were talking about G, it's a couple months ago now, and a lot has changed, yet a lot hasn't.
Mm.
And I think a lot of people will look back at this realizing that they sustained trauma that they haven't really thought about yet, but will have to deal with in order to avoid falling into traps of negative self-talk, bad patterns, self-destructive or self-limiting behaviors. So I really hope that quite a few people tune into T, because I think it could open up some real positive and uplifting discussion.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, and awareness is key. So looking forward to sparking some helpful thoughts and a bit more awareness.
100%. Looking forward to it.
See you then.